Welcome to the Long Way Through Scripture. I'm Catherine Schaefer, and I'm really glad you're here. This podcast is a year-long walk through the Bible, taken 1 week at a time and without the pressure to rush, perform, or keep up. I created this because I needed a way to stay with Scripture that could actually survive real life. Busy days, missed readings, questions, and seasons where faith feels quiet or complicated. So each week, there will be one short episode like this one, meant to gently orient you to the reading ahead. Not to explain everything, not to give answers for every passage, but to help you know where you are in the story and invite you to read at a pace that fits your life. This is not a daily reading challenge. It's not about finishing fast or doing it perfectly. It's simply about staying with the text, with God, and with the story we're all part of. Whether this is your first time reading the Bible or your first time trying again, you're welcome here. So let's begin the long way through Scripture. So this is week 1, Genesis 1 through 11. When we open the Bible at the beginning, there's often an unspoken pressure to understand everything immediately. These opening chapters are familiar and dense. Creation, Adam and Eve, the fall, Cain and Abel, the flood, the Tower of Babel. Many of us have heard these stories before, sometimes simplified, sometimes debated, and sometimes argued over. But for this journey, we are not trying to conquer the opening chapters of Scripture. We are allowing them to set the tone. Genesis chapters 1 through 11 are not a summary. They are foundation. They shape how we understand God, humanity, the world, and the long story that follows. These chapters are not meant to be skimmed for answers. They are meant to be inhabited. The Bible begins not with instruction, but with action. God speaks, and creation responds. Light appears, space forms, order emerges from formlessness. Again and again, God speaks and then sees what he has made. There's intention here, rhythm, care. One of the first things Genesis teaches us is that creation is not a chaotic accident. It is shaped by word and purpose. Before there is productivity, there is light. Before there is work, there is rest. God rests not because he is weary, but because rest is part of the design itself. And this matters, especially for those of us who struggle with the idea that worth must be earned. There's also something quietly important about how much space Genesis gives to beginnings. The text does not rush us out of creation and into conflict. It lingers. It names. It blesses. Again and again, God sees what he has made and calls it good. That repetition is doing more than affirming beauty. It is shaping how we are meant to understand reality itself. Before anything goes wrong, Scripture establishes goodness. That matters because so many of us come to the Bible already braced for correction. We expect to be told what's broken, what's lacking, what needs fixing. Genesis begins somewhere else. It begins with goodness declared before failure ever appears. Even the command given to humanity in the garden is not framed as suspicion, but as trust. Humans are entrusted with care, with naming, with cultivation. Work is not introduced as punishment. It is part of meaningful participation in creation. If you find yourself slowing down here, noticing beauty, structure, intention, that is not distraction. That is formation. Genesis is teaching us that attentiveness itself is a faithful posture. There is no anxiety in these opening pages, no sense that God is scrambling to contain chaos. God speaks calmly, creation responds, time unfolds, evening and morning pass. Nothing here is frantic. For those of us who live in constant urgency, a contrast can feel uncomfortable. But that discomfort is worth noticing. Genesis is often a rhythm that exists before fracture ever enters the story. Humanity enters the narrative not as a solution to a problem, but as a reflection of God's image. Before humans do anything at all, they're named as bearers of God's likeness. Their value is not established by performance, obedience, or output. It is given. The garden is not a test site. It is a place of provision. God gives boundaries, yes, but boundaries inside abundance. Relationship comes before restriction, and then, almost quietly, fracture enters. Genesis 3 does not arrive with thunder. It arrives with conversation. Doubt is introduced subtly, trust bends slowly. The fall does not begin with rebellion, but with suspicion, a question about God's goodness. When the fracture happens, the world does not immediately collapse. Instead, something internal breaks. Awareness shifts, shame enters, hiding begins. What matters here is how God responds. God seeks, calls out, asks questions. Before consequences are named, God covers shame. Clothing comes before judgment. Relationship is addressed before consequences. Genesis does not show God abandoning humanity at the moment of failure. God remains present, speaking inside the fracture. As the story continues, brokenness spreads outward. Cain and Abel show us that sin does not stay contained. What begins as jealousy becomes violence. The rupture between God and humanity spills into human relationships. By the time the earth is filled with people, it is also filled with violence. Scripture tells us that God sees this and that it grieves him. The flood story is not about erasing humanity. It is about restraint and sorrow. God is not indifferent to corruption. He is wounded by it, and still he preserves. A remnant remains. Life continues. The covenant that follows is not built on human goodness. It is built on God's commitment. The rainbow marks restraint, not perfection. God binds himself to the future of a world he knows will remain broken. And then, once again, humanity builds. The Tower of Babel is about more than ambition. It is about fear. Fear of scattering, fear of dependence, fear of vulnerability. Humanity seeks safety through self-made unity and shared pride. The scattering that follows is not destruction. It is slowing. It is mercy. It is God refusing to let the story collapse under a collective self-glorification. And here is where it helps to pause. Genesis chapters 1 through 11 are not meant to leave us with answers. They are meant to leave us with orientation. They show us what God is like. They show us what humanity is like. And they show us the long tension between the two. If this section feels heavy, that is not a sign you're reading it wrong. It is the weight of reality being named honestly. If questions arise, you do not need to resolve them. Genesis is not asking for conclusions. It is asking for attention. You might notice yourself wanting to move faster here, to get to Abram, to get to promise, to get to something that feels more hopeful or personal. But Scripture begins by telling the truth about the world first. It tells the truth about goodness, the truth about fracture, and it tells the truth about a God who stays involved anyway. That is the ground we are standing on as this journey begins. So as you read this week, notice what repeats. Notice how often God speaks. Notice how often God remains present when withdrawal would be easier. This is the beginning of the story, not just of Scripture, but of the long, patient work God continues to do with humanity. And you are not late to it. As you step into this first week of reading, remember that the goal isn't volume or speed. Read slowly. Read a little at a time, or simply sit with the passage and notice what stirs, what confuses, what feels familiar. There's no right way to do this, only an invitation to remain. You can find the full 52-week reading plan and more information about this journey at catherineschafer.com. I'm grateful you've chosen to start here, and I will meet you again next Sunday as we continue one passage at a time.